Welcome to the Best of Dogman Part 4.
Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to the Best of Dogman Part 4. Welcome to the Best of Dogman Part 4. Over 2 hours of our scariest Dogman stories from the last month. Plus, a brand new 2-part story that nobody has ever heard before. Now, lock your doors and windows. Dim the lights. Make sure nobody's under your bed or in your closet. Get comfortable and enjoy this feature-length Dogman special. Story number 1. An entirely new, allegedly true story entitled Dogman Chased My Cat, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. Dear Scary Stories, I've been interested in the debate on your channel as to what exactly Dogman is. My family's had some pretty heavy experiences and know for a fact that Dogman is real. I don't profess to having any answers about what this creature or entity might be, or whether it's evil or just outright mean. I'd like to tell you what happened to me, and maybe it might help someone else to figure it out. I'm a man who's worked all of his life with an early retirement in mind. My goal was to retire by 30 to a beautiful mansion somewhere and then write books or poems or maybe songs for the rest of my life. When I was young, I was a newsboy and I was serious about it. I was up before dawn and late for school every morning, but I knew school was the path to lifelong labor while I was going to retire at 30. By the time I was 22, I had gotten involved in trading on the stock market. I was not good at it. I ended up getting a long list of different jobs to support myself while I kept managing to make the dumbest decisions about when to buy and sell in Wall Street history. Then one day, my ship came in. My broker actually overruled me and invested my money in something I told him not to. He broke the law because he felt that sorry for me, and suddenly I had almost $250,000 almost overnight. Needless to say, I didn't press charges. 3 years earlier, I had married a lady from one of my day jobs. We had a beautiful 2-year-old girl named Anna and a 7-year-old boy cat named Humphrey. Anna wasn't quite as smart as Humphrey yet, but she was catching up fast. She spoke her first 3-word sentence just prior to this all happening. When I slipped and fell on my butt, she said, "Daddy, go boom." My wife argues that go boom can be interpreted as a verb, so it's really a 2-word sentence. But the point is, my Anna is the most brilliant girl in the world. So anyway, I was 42, not 30 as originally planned, but I thought maybe we could afford to move out of the city and get our own small home where I could live out my dream of being a writer. Long story short, we got a place in the country with some land around it and even a small pond I dubbed Walden Jr. Unfortunately, it took about $40,000 or $50,000 of my wife's savings in addition to everything I had to get this place, which was still a bargain. She would have to drive to the commuter train, then take a 50-minute ride to a 10-minute subway trip and back each day to keep her job in the city while I could take care of the baby and walk barefoot in the grass. We were both happy, but she wasn't as happy as I was, and she had a lot more stress in her life than I did. Then, one night, we were having our dinner out back around dusk. The baby and I were happy and relaxed, but my wife had not calmed down yet from her hectic job and the uncomfortable, overcrowded commute home. Suddenly, and very loudly, our cat came screaming out of the forest, and my wife screamed too. And then Anna started crying, and my wife yelled at me that this was my fault because I forced her to spend all her money to live here, and then the entire scene was interrupted by the largest dog either of us had ever seen. Both our jaws dropped at the prehistoric size of this monstrous thing. My wife was the first to break her frozen posture, and she grabbed Anna, bringing her into the house and slamming the door. The cat, which had now reached the door, scratched and screamed to also be let in. I watched this surreal scene behind me, then turned back to see where the huge dog was. But I couldn't see him. In fact, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Then, with horror, I realized I was looking at the underbelly of a beast. I felt dizzy because I was standing up, but seeing the underside of a huge dog, staggering a few steps back gave me greater perspective, but far less balance. I fell hard backward, landing painfully with a tree root in the middle of my back. Now I really was looking up, and what I saw was that the huge dog was now standing like a man. That dog was 5 feet on all fours. It seemed to be over 8 feet tall when standing. It raised its head to the stars and gave this sort of battle cry, the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I turned and ran toward the cat and the back door. My wife was opening it and letting the cat in. I shouted, "Wait!" but reached the door just in time to have it closed and locked in my face. I banged once, but I knew she wasn't going to open, and she shouldn't. She needed to protect the baby, so I ran. I ran to the front of the house where it might be safe for me to go inside. The dogman followed, destroying my yard in the process. He bent one small tree right in half. He tore a huge branch off our oak tree and used it to smash my wife's stone winddial. None of this made sense to me at the time because I had not yet noticed that he had hands. To me, it was noise occurring behind me as I ran to the front. When I got there, I was shocked that my wife, daughter, and cat were in the car, pulling backward out of the driveway. I screamed at her to wait for me, and I swear at first she gave me the "I see you, but I'm going to pretend I don't see you" face, and kept pulling out onto the street. She turned the steering wheel right and got ready to drive off when Anna, God bless her, saw me and pointed me out to her mother. Annoyed, my wife slowed the car, did not stop, but slowed the car down. And she did not open the door for me, but unlocked it. So somehow, I opened the door of a moving car and threw myself inside, landing with a thud. My wife immediately hit the gas, causing the door to slam hard onto my ankle, bruising it. I shouted in pain, and the baby laughed. "Daddy go boom," she squealed, giggling. I have no idea if the creature chased us or not. The only thing I was seeing right then was stars. The ankle would bruise purple and black and ache for months, but it wasn't broken or strained. Our marriage, on the other hand, was either one or the other. And so, my dream, the dream I'd had my entire life, was crushed in a second. And all because Dogman chased my cat. This story continues in part 2 called Dogman Ruined My Life, which is the very last tale in this special. We'll be back right after this. I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279.
I adopted a Dogman puppy. As told to Peter Bernard. Read by Madeline Starr. When I was a little girl, I lived in the country. and used to play in the fields and forests behind my daddy's farm. One day, this funny little dark brown puppy with tall, pointy ears comes wandering out of the bushes, walking on its hind legs like a little man. It was really the cutest thing. I threw a ball, and he would go on all fours running to get it, then pick it up in his mouth and walk back to me on his hind legs to return it. I thought he was the most amazing little puppy in history, and I immediately fell in love with him. He was incredibly smart, and I started envisioning the two of us appearing on stage together, or maybe on television. Walking home, he tagged along like a little boy, only occasionally going on all fours to smell a bug or chase a bird. When I got back, my mom was very impressed that I had already taught this stray puppy how to do a trick walk, but I told her the puppy came with the trick already installed. This caught Daddy's interest, and he came over to have a closer look at my new pet. "That isn't a puppy," he said. Mother and I laughed, then we saw he wasn't joking. "That's a monster," said my daddy as he raised his rifle and took aim. Mom and I screamed, and the puppy got spooked and ran off into the forest. Daddy fired a warning shot over his head to keep him running. Then he turned to me, his eyes angrier than I'd ever seen them. "Don't go playing with stray animals," he shouted. "You already know not to play with stray animals." I thought about explaining, but he stormed into the house before I could. Mom scooted after him, asking him why he had just done what he did. Crying, I ran into the woods to my rock that I would sit on when I felt sad. I just sat there and cried. This was my only private spot that Daddy hadn't found out about yet, so I would go there when I really needed space. I don't know how long I was there. It felt like forever because I was so sad at that moment. Suddenly, though, my little friend came trotting out of the bushes on his hind legs, tongue hanging out, a big smile on his face, and his tail going crazy, wagging extra hard. He jumped into my lap, and I hugged him so hard. It wasn't like we had only met that day. My friendship with this puppy was already a very deep and thorough one. Why would my father want to break up a girl and her puppy? I had never been so hurt by him, or felt so angry. Then I heard Mom calling me home for dinner, and my heart raced. If I left this puppy now, I might never see it again. I remembered the second barn. Well, we called it the second barn, but it was actually our first barn. It was there when my parents bought the place. Daddy didn't like the location of it, though, so he built a new one where he needed it, and just left the old one. It was still structurally sound, so he and Mom had hemmed and hawed about whether to convert it to something new or tear it down. They had argued about it since before I was born, from the way I understood it at the time. Neither of them ever seemed to go out to it, and I could see it from my bedroom window. My parents slept all the way on the other side of the house, and their windows faced in the other direction. I suddenly realized the second barn was the perfect hiding spot for my new little friend. I picked him up in my arms, and he climbed up my shoulder, licking my cheek. I giggled and ran as fast as I could to the second barn. Arriving late for dinner that night, I had to deal with both Mom and Daddy lecturing me about this and that. I probably got lectured to about the puppy as well. I can't remember. I know I just blotted out everything they were saying, thinking about how I was going to sneak food to the dog and what kinds of food I could get to him without being discovered. The next day was the most fun day of my entire childhood. I had a new best friend. In many ways, this puppy was like another human kid to play with. We could play catch, we could play hide and seek, we could chase each other, and he was a much, much better Frisbee player than I was, that's for certain. When Mom called me to come home for dinner, I couldn't believe the entire day had passed so quickly. I wasn't hungry and didn't want to stop playing, so we just kept on chasing each other. I never laughed so hard, and I never had so much fun in my life. Then I heard someone in the forest, and I stopped. We both stopped everything and grew silent. I listened as hard as I could, then noticed my puppy friend was staring toward the patch of woods in the direction my daddy used to work in back then. He was about to discover us. I picked up the puppy and took off toward the barn. He knew where we were headed and jumped out of my arms to run ahead of me on all fours. He zipped inside and went up to his sleeping area. I followed up the ladder and kissed him goodnight. I told him to be a good boy and stay quiet. Then I'd play with him again tomorrow. It felt like he could understand what I meant, even if he didn't understand English. I ran back home, looking in all directions, trying to make certain I didn't run into my father by accident. That night at dinner, Daddy wasn't as angry as the night before. In fact, he seemed almost apologetic. Now, my father never apologized for anything in his life. He saw that as a sign of weakness. So apologetic is too strong a word. But he did seem to have regrets and something to get off his chest. "Don't you have something to say, Henry?" my mother asked into the utter lack of conversation. He wasn't going to say he was sorry. Even at that young age, I knew he was never going to apologize to me for anything. Also, I knew he wasn't going to change his mind and let me have the puppy, because Daddy viewed changing his mind or softening his position to be signs of weakness as well. So, what was he going to say? I had never seen him looking so conflicted before. I had never seen him looking unsure about what to say or do before. That was the first time in my life I didn't see him as Daddy. I saw him as another person like you or me. I was genuinely wondering what could possibly be about to come out of his mouth. I had a few different guesses, but none of them were even close. I'll try to remember what he said, but this is from so long ago, I'm sure I'll be paraphrasing in places. Basically, he gave a speech that started something like this. "Little girl," he began, "it's hard for your daddy to accept it, but you're old enough now that your mother and I think it's time for you to start learning about some grown-up type things." Oh no. Was this that speech? I was kind of hoping I'd get that speech from Mom, not Dad. But then my father took the king of all left turns and careened right off the highway of normal dinner conversation. "There are monsters, little girl. There are monsters in the woods. There are monsters in the woods." Okay, Daddy had lost his mind. I looked to Mom, but she seemed to know he was going to say that. "Don't look at me," she said. "Look at your father when he's speaking to you." So they both had gone crazy. I wondered, do other kids have parents who give them a speech over dinner about how the woods are filled with monsters? I started doing the math in my head about how many more years it would be that I would be living under the roof of a paranoid couple. I felt like it was my responsibility to get them to see psychiatrists, but I knew my father would never talk to a shrink unless he had been fully committed and had no choice. There wasn't much I, as a kid, could do in this situation except hope I could ride it out into adulthood. Suddenly, my childhood was over, and my parents, who had loved unconditionally up until then, seemed like the other to me. I had jumped from a trusting kid to a cynical teenager in a few seconds, entirely skipping over all of adolescence. I continued listening to Dad's speech, but now more from the point of view of someone gathering information about the enemy than from the point of view of a kid getting lectured by her father. "Honey," said Dad with a sad look on his face, "I'm asking you to please listen to me. I'm asking you just as I'd ask any grown-up, just as I'd ask a fellow who was my best friend in the world. And I'm asking you to please consider what I have to say and sleep on it before you say anything back. I'm asking you to consider what I'm saying, not as something your father told you, but as something someone who really cares about you wants you to know, for your own sake." Yet another sharp left turn out of nowhere. Surprised by his candor, I nodded my head in agreement. I would listen to him like I would listen to any other person, and he would talk to me as though I were his equal. This was my first agreement with any adult that I had been asked to agree to, instead of having it thrust upon me. Obviously, my father had never behaved this way before, and he had succeeded in making me curious. I listened to the rest of what he had to say quietly and attentively. Satisfied that we were in agreement, he began again. "Now, I know it seems really mean and wrong to take a puppy away from someone, and in most cases it is. I know it must seem like there's something wrong with me because of the way I acted yesterday, and that's why I want to level with you and tell you a story of something that happened to me back when I wasn't much older than you. I was 15. I was thinking, 15 is a lot older than me. But I remembered I was having a grown-up conversation and decided to look serious and keep quiet. He continued, "Me and my buddy Horace. You don't know him because he moved clear on out of these parts after this story I'm about to tell you happened. In fact, he denies it to this day, but in my opinion, this story is the reason Horace moved out as soon as he was old enough to get a driver's license and a job." So there we were, two 15-year-old boys out hunting, and we caught sight of the biggest buck I had seen up to that point, and one of the biggest I've ever seen since. We both got overexcited and shot at once like amateurs. Nobody ever taught us about gun safety or how to hunt or anything. We were completely out of control and had no idea what a danger we were to ourselves and others. Trust me. So we didn't have any idea if we hit it before it ran off, and we headed over in the direction of where it had been to see what we could see. Sure enough, we found evidence that we had hit it, and we found a clear trail that we began to follow. The trail went deeper and deeper into a pretty thickly wooded area, with a lot of thorny underbrush that tears your skin and all kinds of bugs that drink your blood. We were going through there as quietly as we could manage, but we were still making a lot of noise. Every so often we'd stop to catch our breath and listen to hear if we could hear the buck. We never did, but then one time, we heard someone behind us. At first I thought it was another deer, and I was about to head back in that direction, but the sound of the walking wasn't like a four-legged animal. Horace said, "Someone else is following this deer trail." "Someone wants to steal our buck." That made sense to me. It was some scavenger hunter who heard our amateur-sounding shots and was hoping he could beat us to our own kill and get a free meal. I told Horace to cover me, and he raised his rifle at the bushes behind us. I pointed my gun down, but I was ready to fight if need be. I called out, "Hey you, are you friend or foe?" No answer. The sound of walking toward us continued uninterrupted. I shouted louder this time, thinking maybe he hadn't heard me the first time. "Hello, friend. You don't happen to be following our trail, do you? Because I think me and my buddy got that covered." Still no response. Still the walking continued. Whoever it was, they sounded very close now, right on the other side of these tall bushes and weeds. I knew that had to be a man with a lot of nerve, so I prepared myself for anything. Or so I thought. Because what came out of those bushes was not something any sane person would have ever thought to be prepared to see. Now, I know your mother and I have told you time and time again that there's no such thing as monsters when you get scared at bedtime. And that's true. There's no such thing as monsters under your bed, and there's no such thing as monsters in your closet. But honey, I'm not gonna lie to you. There are monsters in the forest. I know because on that day I saw one. It was 7 feet tall if it was an inch, and probably taller for all I know. It was as tall as a basketball player, but as wide as a football player. It was a man, but it had a dog's head. Not a civilized man, mind you, but a savage one. A hair-covered monster man with a dog head. And I tell you, me and my buddy were surprised to see that. But that thing, it was not surprised to see both of us. It looked like we were exactly what it was expecting to see. We knew we were outmatched. Horace pointed his gun at the ground, and we both avoided looking it in the eye, turning our heads a bit to the ground. I've learned later that this is a good thing to do with a predator, but honestly, it was pure nature that took over us and told us what to do. Horace told me later he never considered shooting it. He figured it would only make it mad. I never considered running because I could tell there's no way I could ever outrun this thing, not on grass and especially not through these thick woods. No, we both knew we were at the mercy of this monster, and the best thing to do was show it we weren't a threat without seeming too much like prey. So we just kind of backed off slowly, and the giant dog thing just walked on by, following the trail to our deer. And we let it. Boy, did we let it go on after that deer. And after it had traveled out of our sight, we quietly got our behinds back the way we came and fell to our knees saying prayers of thanks when we made it back to my parents' farm. Now, I think you know where this story is leading. It's leading back to your so-called puppy. That wasn't no puppy. That was a monster. Do you hear what I'm saying to you? I nodded. I understood. But still, I had no intention of giving up my puppy. I decided he didn't need to know that part. So now I can't remember if this next stuff happened that night or the night after, but it was sometime very soon after my father's monster lecture that I was awakened at night by a crashing noise outside my window. It was a crashing and a banging, really loud. I got up and looked out, but at first I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Then I saw the barn door swing open fast, faster than I'd ever seen it open before. It made me gasp because I couldn't imagine what could be strong enough to throw those heavy doors open like that. Then I saw it. It was exactly as my daddy had described. Well, except this one was a female. I could see even from that distance. It was walking away toward the forest, and walking with it was my puppy. I ran down the stairs and I could hear my father already stirring on the other side of the house. I had to beat him to the barn and remove all evidence that I had been feeding the puppy out there. I never once thought that this might be a dangerous situation to be running into. At that moment, I was more afraid of my father than my puppy's mother. I reached the barn and looked back. I could see Daddy running around from the front of the house, heading in my direction. I didn't think he saw me. I rushed into the barn and looked around for food scraps or water. I didn't see any. I did notice a huge hole in the wall on the side facing the forest. Maybe they had taken the food with them. Then I heard a dog. A large dog. It sounded angry and it sounded like it was up in the loft. I looked up there and saw that the source of the dog noise was not in the loft. It was standing in front of the ladder leading up there. It was so tall, though, that its head was up as high as the loft, and that was the source of my confusion. It was the mate of that female I had just seen. It was the father of my puppy. It bent down, moving its terrifying jaws and huge teeth closer and closer to me. "Get down!" someone screamed. I got down. Then there was a series of loud explosions of gunfire. And there was animal screaming, and there was foul language from my father, and there was a monster loudly exiting through the previously created hole in the barn wall. Daddy picked me up and carried me off, and that's about all I can still remember about the incident. Daddy had the second barn torn down, and he installed a motion tracking security system around the edges of our property. He lived out the rest of his days on that farm and never saw the dog people again. My mother still lives there, and she tells me she still has never heard of anyone in the area ever seeing them ever again. I wonder about my puppy friend. He'd be an adult now. He might have offspring of his own. I wonder if I will ever meet him again. These days, I'm an avid camper. I love deep woods camping, and I love to go alone or with one camping partner. I have no fear at all of the forest. I know that if anything bad happens to me, I'll be safe. After all, one of my best childhood friends is a dogman.
Thanksgiving with Dogman, as told to Peter Bernard. Read by PQ River. Dear Scary Stories, I have a story about Dogman that was painful to live through and proved to me personally that Dogman is evil, a malignant spirit that haunts lands and people. Even when it's discarnate, the sensitive ones can see it in the woods. Sometimes it sees them back and hitches a ride in their body and in their soul. I tend to read a lot of stuff about cryptids in America, especially Sasquatch and Dogman material. I'm fully aware that most people interested in this subject think that the Dogman is an animal who takes that shape all the time, as all natural creatures do. I'm also aware of other Dogman enthusiasts who think that is their main form, but that sometimes they can be invisible or seen by us as orbs of light or energy traveling back and forth between our reality and their own native one. Still others think the Dogman comes from under the earth, where he lives in a semi-real and semi-supernatural state. There are as many theories about the Dogman as there are reported encounters. But where I come from, people assume they are shapeshifters. What I mean by that is it is most often assumed in the parts I grew up in that wizards will shift their form into other animals such as crows, bats, coyotes, and other creatures, and sometimes they maintain their basic human form while appearing to us with the head of an animal. This I know for a fact because I saw this exact thing when I was just a kid. My father had sent me to the 7-Eleven to get him some cigarettes. This was a long time ago. If you wanted to buy cigs or whatever and you were young, you'd tell the clerk it was for your father. We were a small enough community that you'd never get away with lying about it more than once. It was already getting dark as I walked to the store. I knew it would be completely dark on the way back. This made me happy because I would never be allowed out this late when my mother was home. She was staying with one of her sisters who'd moved up north for a week. Someone was getting married or something. I was enjoying everything about being out alone as night approached. The sky looked different. The trees and buildings looked different. The crickets sounded different, and the air tasted better. It was a taste of freedom and adulthood, and that was what I was craving back then. I was about to learn the parts of adulthood that taste bad, though. So I got to the store. I brought the cigarettes up to the counter, and the clerk gave me a lot more trouble than usual. I forget the details, but I just remember us talking it over and me reminding him who my dad was, that sort of thing. And I kept being distracted by what looked like the shape of a man standing outside the front window in or near the bushes. But when I would look over there directly, I wouldn't see anybody. As I left the store, cigarettes in hand, he walked out of the bushes. He was a man wearing jeans and work boots, I think, and I remember a red plaid shirt. He looked entirely human, except he had a dog head. He spoke to me, and he knew my first name. Now, I know you're thinking, it was a teenager who knew my name wearing a mask, but this mask moved when he spoke. Back then, the best masks in existence were Planet of the Apes. I'm talking the original Roddy McDowall movies before computer animation. When the actor talked, the mask barely moved. That was state-of-the-art in masks. But when this dog-headed guy spoke to me, his tongue hung out and he panted in between words. Due to the long snout, he spoke with an odd accent, a dog accent, I guess, but in real life, a dog accent sounds nothing like Scooby-Doo. It sounds closer to a dog barking the alphabet, but it's not cute at all. In fact, it's absolutely terrifying. I dropped the cigarettes and ran home. My father, already annoyed at me for taking so long, now was furious at me for bringing him home nothing but his change. He took me by the shoulder, and we marched all the way back to the 7-Eleven. I kept pleading at him that there was a dog-headed wizard at the 7-Eleven, and he called me all sorts of insulting names which are no longer considered politically correct to repeat. Basically, he thought I was a coward who imagined fake things to be frightened of. When we finally approached the hedges and bushes out in front of the store, I froze and stared left and right. I couldn't see the wizard, but that didn't mean he wasn't there. I didn't even notice the cigarettes, still in the bag, still laying where I dropped them. My father made me pick them up and we walked home together. He never believed me, but I don't understand why. What other reason did he think I had for dropping the cigarettes and running home?
Sometimes adults are so logical that they're illogical.
For the reasons I have just explained, I viewed werewolves or dog-headed people as a very real thing, but I thought they were all wizards or shamans deliberately transforming themselves into these monstrous forms for reasons that only made sense to them. At Thanksgiving, a year or two after that, when I was 13 or 14, I learned that some people who don't choose this can be inflicted with a similar transformation. I learned that the Dogman is a force or entity unto itself, existing on multiple levels simultaneously, and in every way possible. The Dogman is evil. That Thanksgiving in question, my favorite uncle from when I was a kid was finally allowed back into the United States. I don't remember or know the details, but he had been deported one time for some reason that didn't matter to a kid. All I knew and cared about was that I would finally get to see him again after, I want to say, 3 or 4 years. Let's call him Uncle Manny, although that was not his real name. When he arrived that day, Manny got a hero's welcome. We all loved him, and we had missed him badly. But Uncle Manny didn't seem quite as happy to see us as we had been to see him. In fact, he didn't seem as happy as he used to seem just in general. He smiled, and he made eye contact, and he said and did all the right things, and yet somehow, at the same time, he seemed sort of distracted. He kept looking at his watch, for one thing. Eventually, one of my other uncles asked him if he had a hot date he had to get to and if we were keeping him. Instead of joking back, Uncle Manny acted guilty, then defensive, then apologetic. This was not the same Uncle Manny. He said he needed to go for a walk to smoke a cigarette and clear his head. Dad said he was welcome to smoke right here and offered him an ashtray. Uncle Manny insisted he needed to walk alone, and he'd be fine. He left, and while the adults resumed their merriment, I quietly snuck my winter coat on and followed Uncle Manny at a discreet distance, curious where he wanted to go. He hadn't been here for years, but he was walking with a purpose, and it was clear he still knew the area and that he had a specific destination in mind. After a bit of walking, I could see that where he was headed was the area we called the dump, which was actually a patch of forest connected to the Botanical Gardens wild areas. Local people would dump garbage there illegally. I never understood why, but somebody did. It was always full of trash. As Uncle Manny entered the trees into the dump forest, he took off his winter coat and hung it on the branch of a tree. I don't know exactly what the temperature was that day, but I was watching my breath in front of me, so it was frigid. Seeing Uncle Manny hanging his coat on the tree made my entire world spin. Something was very, very wrong here. Was he sick? Maybe if he had a temperature, he'd feel warm and take his coat off? What would make him do that? I thought about going back and telling an adult, but I didn't want to be a rat fink, and also I wasn't sure if they would understand what I was trying to tell them. I wanted to follow Uncle Manny, but I now realized I might find something I didn't want to find. I used the few stealth techniques I knew back then and proceeded to spend all my courage continuing to follow my uncle into the trees and illegally dumped garbage. I heard small mammals running around, but was grateful not to see them. I was not a huge fan of the kinds of small animals that tended to hang around the dump. I tried to sink into a pure natural awareness so that I could follow my uncle, but also stay aware of anything else that might run into my way. And I noticed it. The silence. The unnatural silence all around me. All the animals had stopped moving. Even the wind sort of died down. I had to stop too. It had become so silent that if I were to take a step at that moment, I would most likely be heard in a pretty wide area. Due to the wall of old apartment buildings across the street, it might even echo. So, I just stood still, held my breath, and listened. Where had my uncle gone? There was no sound in front of me, just none. I wondered if he knew I was following him and if he was standing still, same as I was. I could sense just absolutely nothing from in front of me. All that time and energy I had spent sensing the area in front had left me vulnerable from the rear. I realized that suddenly as I heard an animal in anger behind me. Not a small animal, a mammal, but a large one. I turned suddenly, and to my surprise, I saw Uncle Manny. But when I looked up into his eyes, they looked back at me through the head of a dog or wolf. Uncle Manny was a wizard? This was what he was hiding, that he had become a shape-shifting brujo? I relaxed a bit, because it could have been so many other worse things. But Uncle Manny didn't relax. Uncle Manny growled. I noticed that, although he was still dressed as before, he was now hairy, all over. He was not speaking to me. He was making guttural animal noises. He was not a dog-headed wizard at all. Uncle Manny was a werewolf. And in this mindless, savage state, he was about to end everything for me. Except, bam, out of nowhere, my father tackled Uncle Manny from the left side, and the two of them rolled around in the dry leaves and illegal dumping, fighting insanely. Thank God my father had followed me, following his brother. As I explained earlier, my father would send me for a mile walk alone at night. He wasn't following because he thought there'd be danger. He was just as curious as I was, and now that curiosity was going to get him killed. I picked up a big log, the biggest I could hold safely, and I walked toward the two fighting male hominids. Dad was cut all over, and I couldn't be sure who was going to win. I decided it was up to me to clonk my favorite uncle on the back of the head to save my father. Tears streaming down my face, I lifted the log over my head, then brought it down as hard as I could. Completely missing Uncle Manny and unwittingly separating the two from fighting. Without thinking, The dogman, which had been my uncle, flew toward me, clearly intending to tear me to shreds. I closed my eyes and knew this was the last moment of my life. Everything that had ever happened to me again in my mind. I closed my eyes and hoped it would end quickly. But instead of getting ripped apart, I heard that clonk sound I had wanted to hear a moment earlier. Opening my eyes, I saw that my father had used the log to subdue our feral relative, who was now unconscious and becoming human again as we watched. The change doesn't look anything like it does in the movies. It's not hair going back into his body. It's the accepted perception of his appearance no longer being what it was a few seconds earlier. It's like a Mandela effect with you remembering both versions, if you can follow me. It's a metaphysical or perceptual change that is so real and so definitive that it may as well be a physical change. In fact, it is that, too. We revived my uncle, and he told us how he had been cursed by the grandmother of a girl he cheated on. He doesn't transform into a werewolf during the full moon, or only at night, or anything like that. The way the curse works is that wherever he goes, he is attracted by nature to where evil resides nearby. He's drawn to places like the dump because literal evil itself subsists there, waiting for a cursed soul to inhabit. So, you might almost say that wherever my uncle lives, he is drawn to allow himself to be possessed by the evil of that area itself, and in doing so, he becomes the Dogman. He becomes the most evil thing that can actually exist or partially exist in our reality. I never saw my uncle again. He was ashamed at having brought evil into the lives of his own family. He went away and none of us ever heard from him again. So that Thanksgiving, in losing my favorite uncle, I learned that the Dogman is not a werewolf. The Dogman is not from under the earth. The Dogman is not a dog-headed wizard or ancient god form. The Dogman is everything bad about where you are, all rolled together and turned into a savage monster. The Dogman is evil, plain and simple. The Dogman defines evil.
The Dogman of Tarrytown, as told to Peter Bernard, read by Madeline Starr. I once saw a dogman or werewolf outside the McDonald's in Tarrytown, New York, and I'm about to tell you exactly how it happened. I was out dancing in the city with my friend Marina, who I hadn't seen since her family moved upstate a few months earlier. We used to go dancing every weekend, and sometimes during the week as well, when she lived in Brooklyn, so I missed getting to hang out. I asked her how things were upstate, and for the most part, she was miserable and saving up to move out. Her parents were treating her okay, and she said the town is very beautiful. It's just that she is a city girl and feels out of place up there. She did tell me that she had been hanging out at this cemetery, which is supposedly the same cemetery that the Headless Horseman chased Ichabod Crane over. I don't know if that story is real, but the writer, Washington Irving, said it in this real cemetery. I got goosebumps at the idea of going to the actual bridge and getting to see in my eye how it happened in the story. I asked her when I could come up to visit, and somehow she talked me into coming home with her that night. We got the last Metro North train from Grand Central, which I think left at 1:30 or 2 a.m., and we sat in a car that was relatively empty. Marina started pulling jeans up under her dress while we were seated. "Are you cold?" I asked. "Nah," she answered. "I just want to stop in the 24-hour McDonald's on the walk home, and there are usually creepy all-nighters in there who stare at my legs." Oh, thanks for the warning, I grouched, as I was in a mini dress and was now wondering if I had made the wrong decision agreeing to go home with her tonight. Oh, don't worry, the creepers and Mickey D's don't bite, she teased me. Their fleas bite, but they don't. The train was running late for some reason. I don't remember if they even explained why, and we didn't get to Tarrytown until after 3 a.m. It was a warm late summer or early autumn night, and the crickets were mega loud. McDonald's was right nearby, and we were both starving. Marina said the walk to her parents' place was about 15 minutes if we cut through the woods. Wait, I said. We're going to cut through the woods at 3 or 4 a.m.? Could it be more dangerous than that time we got lost in Queens? She asked. I wondered how that question was supposed to make me feel better. Sure enough, there were creepers in McDonald's, and it didn't make them stare less that Marina had put her jeans on. I think we could have gotten stares if we wore burqas with that crowd. I asked Marina if we could get something to go. Nah, we need to eat here, she responded, 'cause McDonald's paper wrappers wake my mother up, and then she wants half my french fries as the waking mom tax. Besides, I gotta go before we leave. I felt like we were eating in a movie. I never felt like everybody in a place was staring at me before. Everybody but the employees, who all seemed brain dead. Maybe they were at this hour. Marina was still excited from being out and talked loudly, which only encouraged the old guys to pay more attention to us. It felt like we were there 7 or 8 years, but I guess it was probably around 40 minutes. When we finished eating, I was so excited to go, but Marina said to throw the food out while she went to the ladies' room, and then we could split. I threw the food out, and there was a guy sitting next to the garbage with a bright red face. He was staring at me and smiling. When I threw the food out, he started laughing. I looked at him, and he just kept looking at me and laughing. Now I really felt like I was in a movie. I was thinking how if I had gone home instead of here, I'd have been asleep for some time now and dreaming instead of walking through this waking nightmare. I walked over to the counter, my loud shoes echoing in the place. Nobody was saying anything, everyone was just watching me, or watching their favorite parts of me at least. I waited at the front counter until the person working there noticed me. In a sleepy voice, he mumbled, "Can I take your order?" while barely opening his mouth and nearly closing his tired-looking eyes. I already ordered before, I reminded him, to which he didn't react at all. Do you know there's a red-faced man laughing at me over there? It sounded dumb when I put it that way. The employee wasn't grasping the seriousness of the situation. I'm sorry, he said, struggling to wake up. What did you say you wanted to order? Looking back on it, I'm not sure why I didn't just join Marina in the bathroom, safety in numbers and all that. But I was still smoking cigarettes back then, so I went outside for a smoke instead. Fortunately, the creepers were weak from malnutrition resulting from eating McDonald's all the time, so none of them had the strength to follow me out. Now, outside the McDonald's, over there is basically a street and a parking lot. There's a forest off in the distance and hills or mountains past the edge of town. But there's no forest in town or anything, like Marina was saying to me. She just made all that up to spook me. That's her sense of humor. Anyway, there were trees off in the distance, but they just seemed like the kind of trees you see in suburban towns. It wasn't like the entrance to a forest or anything. And in the trees, I saw this dark shape, right? And it stepped out of the shadows a bit, and I swear I could see a kind of werewolf man thing standing there. It was like American Werewolf in London, but it stood on its 2 legs. What I mean is, it had a long snout and tall ears. It wasn't like a hairy man. It was a huge, hairy dog that stood up. I couldn't really tell you what color it was, but I could make out the silhouette, and I could see the body shape very clearly. Oh, there is no way, I said out loud, and the thing took another step closer to me. I could see the shape of its legs, which were bent backwards like a dog's legs. It didn't look like a costume. Oh, and get this. It had a tail. It was not wagging its tail. It did not seem like a happy dog. My mother always told me, you can wake yourself up from a dream by pinching yourself. So I did that. It didn't wake me up, and I don't think that would work in a dream anyway. A dream pinch wouldn't hurt. It's not a real pinch. The idea of it made about as much sense as this Dogman monster thing that seemed to be edging slowly closer to me. How had it gotten there? Assuming it came from the forest and the mountains beyond, the only way it could have gotten to the patch of trees it was standing in was if it had left the forest and walked through the town. Then again, it was the middle of the night, and nothing but the McDonald's seemed to be open. So maybe a werewolf could walk straight through town around here without being noticed. Nothing made sense. "You don't make any sense," I shouted to the tall dog. "You don't make any sense, and you can't possibly exist." The dog man didn't like that. He started growling. And he did something else, too. He started running. He started running directly at me. I screamed like a horror movie star and got back in the McDonald's. I ran as fast as I could in my vinyl boots on that slippery floor to the ladies' room. Now at least 2 of the creepers were laughing at me. There are no locks on doors in that place. If the dog man was going to come inside, he could feast on a buffet of creepy old dudes and maybe never make it to the bathrooms in the back. Maybe I'd be safe in the ladies' room. Good plan, except that I was about to swing the door in, and Marina swung it out, directly into me, knocking me a step or 2 backward, and eliciting applause from my red-faced fan. "What's wrong with you?" Marina asked. "There is a monster outside," I shouted. My audience laughed and cheered. I could tell this was the best show they'd gotten in a long time. "There's a what? Where?" laughed Marina. "There's a werewolf outside and it's running this way," I screamed, trying to push her back in the ladies' room. She pushed back and succeeded in getting past me. "There's no monster outside, and I'll prove it," Marina said as she marched to the front door of the McDonald's. "No!" I shouted and flinched. I was about to see something terrible happen to my good friend through the greasy glass doors of this burger place. Marina walked outside, looked around, then looked back in at me and shrugged her shoulders. Then she put one hand on either side of her mouth and started shouting into the night. "Wolfman!" she yelled. "Yoo-hoo, Wolfie! Come and get it! Dinner is served!" She shook her booty to tempt the werewolf. I was sweating and shaking all over. Tears were running down my cheeks. "Please, Marina," I pleaded. "Please come back inside." Eventually she did, and she took my hand, telling me it was time to go home. But she didn't get it. I hadn't imagined what I saw. It was a very real thing. It was an impossible thing, but that didn't make it any less real. There was no way I was leaving that McDonald's until the sun came up. I'd rather be in here with the creepers than out there with the monsters. I ordered 2 large coffees, and our fans applauded. We left the establishment at dawn, jittery from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. Rather than walk Marina home, I had her walk me back to the Metro North station. I couldn't wait to get out of that place. We may have rats in the city, and we may have roaches, and we may have those other kind of roaches, you know, the super large mouth-sized ones. And we may have crime, and we may have homelessness, and we may have poverty. But I'm going to tell you one thing we don't have in New York City. We don't have Dogman.
I can't believe he was appearing with us December 9th and 10th at the Hanover Mall near Boston, yo! Oh my god!
The real story of raising a Dogman puppy, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ritter. Hey, Scary Stories. Recently, you had a video in which some girl was claiming she knew a Dogman puppy. I could tell right away that it wasn't a true story. I know because, well, I just know. And now, I'm going to tell you the story of how I know. Because I actually raised a Dogman pup. Now, if you look up a map on the internet of where Dogman lives in America, you'll see that the answer is everywhere. And that's about all I'm going to tell you about where I come from and where I raise this animal, because I don't want tourists coming around and messing up the ecosystem. All I'm going to say is that my family owns a lot of land that we have set aside as a kind of unofficial private sanctuary for certain very rare American animals. Some so rare that they aren't even supposed to exist. Now, the entire reason I want to keep this location as secret as I still can is because of what happened to set this story in motion. Okay, this is back near 27 years ago when I was still a boy. My older cousin and I were out camping deep in our family woods. We were taken camping in that forest since we were babies. It had the smell of us all over it. We even had names for some of the bears. We were that familiar with the location. But don't get the idea that we humanized those creatures. We might have called the big bear Bongo, but we always brought a rifle with us in case Bongo needed a bango, if you catch my drift. Even at that age, we were seasoned woodsmen. I would not recommend anyone arming their kids and letting them loose in the forest nowadays, but back then it wasn't as uncommon. At any rate, we knew our way around a firearm, and we were trained how to survive in the forest with nothing but a knife. We weren't a survivalist family, but my great-great-granddaddy had made the family's millions off of first fur trading, then later forestry and logging. We all took naturally to the woods, and we loved it as the source of life and also of our clan's wealth. One of the animal species our family knew that lived in the forest was the dogman, or a specific species of upright walking canid which was colored dark gray with pointed ears. My cousin had seen one, and my parents had both seen them on more than one occasion, so even though I had not personally seen one yet, I was fully aware of their very real existence. Every time we were out camping and we heard a dog-like sound in the distance, I would perk up and look at whoever I was camping with, asking quietly, "Is it?" And so far it had never been. A dogman, I mean. We called them werewolves or wolfmen back then, although we didn't think they changed themselves back into Lon Chaney the next morning. That was just a name to call them at the time. But whenever I was out camping, it seemed the only things we'd hear howling in the night would be wolves or coyotes or sometimes just regular old dogs. Not this night, however. We heard a terrible commotion mixing very loud, very deep growls with the shouting of human men, and then a gunshot. "Poachers on your daddy's land," my cousin whispered, followed quickly by the scream of some very, very large, very, very unhappy sounding creature. "Poachers done run into the dogman," my cousin continued. I knew now that it was the sound of Dogman that I heard, but I wondered if he had been injured, or if that was a roar of defiance, or maybe some third possibility. I also wondered if the dogmen or the hunters might head in our direction, and asked my cousin, shouldn't we be getting dressed and armed? He agreed, and so we got ready in case we were about to have a hostile encounter in the middle of the night. What we got instead was a whole lot of quiet, and yes, that's a very strange thing after hearing roars and rifles. The whole forest just got very quiet. Then, I'm not sure how long after, we heard something coming through the trees and brush into our camp. We could tell it was not something very large. I guessed that it was a baby deer, and my cousin guessed it was a large hare or rabbit. We were both wrong. It was a puppy. It was gray, but it was on all fours like a regular puppy. It was not walking like a tiny dogman Rory Calhoun. It just seemed to be a little puppy. My cousin and I took it in and gave it some of our leftover corned beef hash to eat. We thought at the time that it was some kind of dog born in the wild to escape pets or the offspring of escaped pets. My cousin pointed out that this little guy might have just lost one or both parents, but on the other hand, they might be coming back at any time looking to reclaim their young one. We decided that, since feral dogs often run in packs and can be as destructive as anything else in the wild, we should take turns sleeping with the other keeping guard. We had totally forgotten that we originally thought we heard a dogman earlier in the night. This puppy did not in any way resemble a monster, and it never once got up on its hind legs, not even for a second. We never connected it to the dogmen we knew were in the area. I know I personally never even thought that the dogmen ever were puppies. I kind of felt from the way everybody always described them as evil, that maybe they just sort of looked that way because they were cursed or something. I really hadn't thought it out clearly. I was a kid. A kid can hug a guy dressed as Mickey Mouse at Disney World and feel he's hugged Mickey, even though at the same time he knows it's just someone dressed as Mickey and that Mickey is just an imaginary mouse. All these things recognized as contradictory for adults can exist simultaneously and quite logically in the minds of kids. And so, to me, the werewolves were animals that lived in the woods, yet they somehow were never young and never grew old. They were boogeymen, but their existence was based on the laws of nature. Mostly. By the morning, nothing else dramatic had happened, and we headed on home with the puppy. I named him Chester after my deceased great-uncle on my mother's side, who everyone said I took after. Now, the reason I know that previous Dogman puppy story you ran was untrue is because we didn't understand that that's what the thing was for another full 2 or 3 years. To us, it was just a puppy like any other. By the time it started standing on its hind legs and running around, it didn't look like any kind of puppy anymore. It looked like a full-size dog about the size of a Great Dane. That other person claimed she took in a puppy that walked on its hind legs. Now, how is a puppy supposed to walk on its hind legs? They aren't developed yet. He's still learning to run on all 4 legs at that stage of his life. These people just send you fantasies, what they wish happened in nature, but I'm here to tell you the real deal. There ain't no unicorns, and there ain't no cute little puppies running around on their hind legs playing frisbee. If you're going to tell stories about Dogman, get your facts straight. So now, even at that point, we still thought we had a dog with mutated front paws that could sometimes run around on its hind legs. His front legs by then were becoming more like arms and claws now that I think about it, but it hadn't set off any alarm bells for any of us at the time because he was a dog that we all liked. We thought old Chester was a weirdo, but we hadn't caught on yet that this was anything but a regular dog. We played with him. He was great at playing fetch, and he was an honest-to-goodness good friend to every single member of our family. So we ignored his weird-looking front legs the way you'd ignore a birthmark on your best friend's cheek. The thing is, old Chester, he just didn't stop growing. Soon he was the largest dog I'd ever seen, when he was on all fours, which he nearly always was. He really only went up on his hind legs to reach up onto a tree branch when he was hunting a bird or to steal a box of breakfast cereal off our pantry's top shelf. So we weren't really thinking of it as him walking bipedally. We were just noticing how tall he was when he leaned back on his hind legs, bigger than any Marmaduke dog I ever saw. Up till now, I had him sleeping on the rug in my bedroom, but now my daddy and I had to empty out the old unused chicken coop enclosure behind the house for him to sleep in at night. He whined and complained. He thought he was one of the people and wanted to sleep inside. One night, when we were trying to put him in the cage so we could all go to bed, he stood up on his hind legs and howled. He now stood way taller than any of us, and I swear, my entire family say they got chills all over their bodies when he did that. He wasn't leaning on the house or a tree or something to steady himself. He was just standing on his hind legs, looking quite steadily, all on his own, howling his head off, with a scream that made my ears literally hurt. We all realized at that moment that Chester wasn't born to be any kind of house pet. And I knew I had a decision to make. Do I let this creature loose? This creature big enough to kill a man? Do I release it into the wild where it might get hungry enough to do just that? Or, on the other hand, would releasing him into the woods with the scent of man all over him just spell a death sentence when he encountered others of his own kind? Like I said, I had some thinking to do. I never once thought to hand him over to science or a zoo. That would be like putting an innocent person in prison or worse. Not to mention, these woods would be ours no longer. They'd be crawling with dogman hunters, both professional and amateur. My thinking was interrupted as I saw Granddaddy running from the house with a rifle. We stopped him before he shot. He didn't realize it was Chester. He told us he thought we were under attack by a giant werewolf. I knew then what I had to do. I took that rifle from Granddaddy, and I led old Chester out into the woods. I still look back on that moment as the separating point from when I was a kid to when I was a man. When you realize that your duty in a situation outweighs your heart, that is the moment you're no longer a child and are now an adult instead. So my eyes blinded with tears, I led my good friend Chester out to where I'd been camping that night when I first met him as a puppy. I don't exactly know why I did that, and it made the entire situation a lot more emotional for me personally. When we got there, I had to cry for a little while just to get it out of my system. Then I yelled at old Chester, the way I'd seen a kid in a movie yell at a dog that he didn't want to follow him home. I turned to leave, and I knew he'd follow me, so I turned around and fired my rifle right up near his face. I missed, but I made sure not to miss by much. By now, I was red-faced, screaming at him to stay away and not follow me back. I walked a bit into the forest and looked over my shoulder. Old Chester was standing there with the saddest look on his face, holding 2 trees apart with his hands to get a better look at me. By now they were in no ways paws. They were hands with opposable thumbs and immense claws like I'd never seen on anything else alive. It's incredible that I used to be able to hold them in one hand, only like 2.5 years earlier. This dog was maybe 3 years old, and yet he was 1.5 feet taller than my father when he stood up. It didn't look like he was done growing yet. I had to fire near him a couple more times, but eventually stopped following. The next morning we saw that the former chicken coop had been broken into. We figured Chester had come back to sleep, but he beat it out of there before we got up. Daddy said we had to dismantle and trash the structure to keep him from coming back and to send the message that this wasn't his home anymore. I agreed, but my heart was aching as I tore that old chicken coop apart. Hurts now just to write about it, even as an adult, decades later. That's why I guess I can sometimes get upset when I hear people telling stories of dogmen that aren't true. They don't know how bad it felt to have to give up my best friend. And unlike that girl in that story, I felt kind of uneasy in that or any other forest I might go out into. Yes, one of my best childhood friends was a dogman, but I had to chase him away. He has no reason to think any kind thoughts about me. I took his family and his life away from him after acting like his father and his brother for 3 whole years. I betrayed that animal. I don't even know if he survived on his own. Maybe he didn't last 1 year. On the other hand, maybe he kept growing and now is a giant monster of a dogman. The kind of a dogman with a grudge against humanity, and most especially against me. When your entire life has been changed and reshaped by knowing a young dogman pup the way mine has been, you have pretty thin skin about people who make light of the subject. I have recurring nightmares about being chased through the woods by my own boy, my own best friend Chester, who now has grown into a dogman 10 or 11 feet tall. People tell me it's just my guilt chasing me in the dream, but if so, my guilt looks just like Chester, the huge, gray dogman. Strange, monkey-faced dogman. As told to Peter Bernard. Read by PQ River. I have a story about what people call dogman, but what we used to call a rougarou. In fact, we still call them rougarou, but I'm pretty sure it's the same thing as a dogman or werewolf. Some people think they are humans who change form. Others, like me, think they're just a kind of predatory animal that lives down here in Louisiana. We used to see it a few times each year, usually in autumn and early winter. I always felt like they were passing through as they migrated south to avoid the cold weather, but I have no evidence to prove that. Heck, I don't even have evidence to prove that the rougarou exists. But when I was a kid, you would be very aware of it, because rougarou can kill people if they're hungry enough, and migratory predators can get extremely hungry. People who aren't from around this area don't believe that I used to see the Wolfman regularly. They tell me that to see even one in your lifetime is like winning the lottery. I'm sure that's true nowadays, but back in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up, you could only reach our house by following a dirt road. It had been a farm in my grandpa's time, but all we had left when I was a kid was an old cow and fields that the government paid my father not to plow. So basically we lived off government assistance and contributed nothing. Dad hunted for our food and spent the government money on gambling as far as I can tell, but I have nothing to complain about. I grew up never wanting for anything and with a lot more freedom than anyone can reasonably expect from life anymore. About the only bad thing about growing up where I did and when I did, was our extra predator. We had to take additional precautions against the rougarou, or dogman. Now I say we had to, but in all honesty, I had never heard of someone getting attacked by the rougarou. Then again, as they say, dead men don't tell tales. Maybe we only hear the stories about the ones that got away. When my family and I would encounter the animal was when we were hunting, and also this one time when we were just hiking as far into the forest as we could. That time, we were sort of taking some time off to relax, but also to investigate whether it might be worth it to try to hunt further into the forest. We weren't really clear at the time who owned the land, but we figured we'd find that out later if it turned out to be good hunting land. As it turns out, the forests over there are very wet, and pretty soon you can't tell the difference between the streams of the land, and it's just basically swamp. A lot of streams and small rivers running through mud, with occasional 20-foot to 100-foot round islands growing spooky-looking giant bent-over trees on them. The swamp was loud. Always loud, with insects and birds and things you didn't see making splashing noises. And every sound you heard might be something dangerous. The only thing scarier than the sounds of a living swamp are when it goes silent in the swamp. That only happens because even the swamp itself is afraid of the dogman. We had a general protocol with the dogman back then. Any sort of pointing directly to the ground indicated you had seen one of the monsters. We would get the attention of whoever was with us, point down or give a thumbs down sign while looking in the direction you saw the creature. Then we would all get down low and remain as silent as we could for whatever period of time it took before the forest seemed to return to normal. If we'd seen a rougarou in one area, we'd warn others we knew to steer clear of that location for the next week or two. It usually didn't seem to take the creatures much longer than that to work their way through our area each year. Now, I want to reiterate, the whole migration theory is just an idea I've had. My father once asked me if they migrate south in the fall, when do they migrate back up here? If they're only seen in the autumn, he thought, maybe they only come out in the autumn. Maybe they live in caves. Maybe they're just visiting from outer space. Or from Hades. Yeah, I would roll my eyes when he said those things too, like you might have just done. To me, the wolfmen were just another thing that could kill you in the local forests and swamps. I didn't even know they weren't considered real in other parts of the country until I was like 17 or 18. So when my father and my grandmother would go on and on with their spooky old stories about the rougarou being a monster with ties to Satan, I'd smile and nod my head politely, then file their ideas in my mental wastebasket. I know some of you are wondering what our encounters with Dogman were like and want to know every detail. Unfortunately, like I said before, our protocol was to get down low and hide after signaling anyone else in the group. For this reason, none of us caught more of a glimpse or two of the monster each time, and usually from the waist up. I've read and heard about them walking on dog-like hind legs, but I can't honestly say that I ever saw the legs at all. I would make out the silhouette of a tall figure with tall, pointed ears like a hare, but with a long, pointed muzzle, like a German Shepherd or maybe a Doberman Pinscher. They were always colored dark or standing in the dark when I glimpsed them, and on one occasion I saw one grinning, or grimacing, or baring its teeth. It looked like it was smiling at something. At the same time, it looked like it was threatening that something. I thought if a rougarou ever looked back at me in the eyes, it would probably drop right on the spot. I'm intensely afraid of those animals. To repeat myself, I'd never heard a story of anyone being injured or killed by one of them, at least not any stories I could take seriously, yet their mere presence made me shake all over uncontrollably. I once came upon bear cubs with their angry mother, and I was less nervous than I was each time I became aware a dogman was around. And to underscore the point, I had known 2 different men who had got attacked by bears. Both died when I was very young. So, even though my mind should have placed bears on the top of the list of things to be feared, my subconscious overruled my reasoning mind when the subject was the man-wolf. Now, the story I want to get to is the one about the weird-looking rougarou. That happened after I got back from spending 4 years at college up north. I hadn't been hunting in all that time, and I came back more of a city person. I now felt frightened of the idea of even entering the woods. Before, risking my life daily was just a thing that people did. After attending college, though, I couldn't come up with any logical reason to place myself in possible danger unless it were absolutely necessary. I initially had felt I would rest a bit after college, and pick a city to move to and start having adventures of my own. Instead, with the easy living my father's government payoffs granted all of us, I became lazy and just sort of melted into a useless lifestyle of watching TV and staring at the clouds. My friends I grew up with had all moved to big cities and were living the adventures I laid on the couch and daydreamed about. And I was too chicken to go back in the forest, so I wasn't even getting any exercise at all, either physical or mental. Plus, I had no social life outside of my dreams. Then one day, an ex-girlfriend of mine from school invited me to come stay for a week with her and a bunch of friends at a big family cabin of hers. The thing was practically a mini mansion, except it was located in the middle of nowhere in a forest in a state I had never visited. I was about to decline the invitation, but I made the mistake of mentioning it to my mother. She told me I was going to go. I said I was not going to go. She said I was going to go, or she was going to make me stay out in the outhouse because my moping around her home doing nothing was driving her crazy. So I accepted the invitation and reluctantly got on a bus headed in the direction of an ex-girlfriend I really didn't want to get back together with. Traveling 3 or 4 states over to visit an ex-girlfriend is kind of sending her the message that you like her times 3, which I only liked her about 1.5 times. When I got there and found that I was in a group of about a dozen and that I already knew 5 people, I relaxed and had fun. Then my ex and I started hanging out together anyway. It wasn't like we felt we had to. The second night there, she took me by the hand and led me on a dirt path through the trees. I'd say the forest was about 50 feet away from the path on our right and around 90 or 100 feet away on our left. The moon and stars seemed extra bright, and the crickets and insects created an almost dizzying white noise effect. It really was very romantic being there with her. We were enjoying each other's presence when suddenly something wasn't there anymore. It was the crickets. They weren't chirping any longer. I instinctively pointed at the ground, looking around me in all directions. Of course, this just made me look like a crazy person to my ex. "Why are you pointing to the ground?" she asked me as though I were insane. I held my finger to my mouth, hoping she would get the idea to be quiet. Then the smell hit us. It smelled like something died. But then I saw it, and it must not have been dead because it kept moving back and forth behind a tree, spying on me and my ex. Remember when I said I would drop if Dogman ever looked at me? Well, my knees buckled right on cue. I found myself seated on the dirt behind some tall grass that now blocked my field of vision. I thought about getting up. Then that seemed too complicated, so I thought about thinking about getting up. Then I could feel that I was going to pass out. Suddenly, my ex was squatting down next to me. She looked very concerned, and she was whispering to me. I remember thinking it was funny that she was trying to keep a secret from the forest. The forest already knows everything about you, I wanted to tell her. My mouth seemed to be disconnected, though, so I couldn't say anything. I decided to try to send her the thought telepathically. I'm not sure if it worked or not, but she was soon lifting me, and I was leaning against a tree, barely standing again. I scanned the tree line for the rougarou I'd seen earlier and spotted it quickly. I pointed. My ex was talking quietly, but it was gibberish to me, utter nonsense. I tapped her on the shoulder and pointed again to the dogman hiding behind the tree. She turned and looked. Angrily, she turned back to me, now shouting about how she didn't see anything. She started speaking faster and faster, louder and louder, and then my ex-girlfriend got interrupted. The dogman stepped out from behind the tree, and he screamed. I've heard a bomb go off from 400 feet away, and it did not provide the impact this rougarou's howl or bark did. It was almost like it solidified the air and used it to punch you in the stomach. I remember watching my ex, now in shock, staring at the monster bellowing at us and thinking that this was a classic good news, bad news situation. The good news is my ex-girlfriend finally understands what is happening, and the bad news is that it's too late because the dogman is going to eat us. We both turned and ran. We ran as fast and as desperately as any prey ever has. But as I turned to run away like a rabbit sighted by a hawk, I noticed the strangest thing about the dogman. It had a very short snout. It had no tall ears on top. It looked just like every other dogman I've ever seen, but instead of a dog head on top, it had a monkey or ape head on top. It was only when we got back to the cabin and we told the story to the others that I made the connection and realized we'd seen Bigfoot. I'd seen some things on TV, and I'm sure I'd seen the Patterson film by then, but my expectations were so geared to expecting the rougarou that I now think I jumped to conclusions. Whatever the monster was, it killed what was left of my relationship with that girl. Her superstitious friends said boys who attract monsters don't make good long-term mates, and other immature things like that, and pretty soon after, she wouldn't give me the time of day anymore. That was the last time I've ever seen a monster of any sort other than the humankind that live all around me here in the city. I don't mean this in a bad way at all, but I can't even imagine going back to live in the country. Here, all the people have people heads. Back in the forests of the United States, I know for a fact that there are men with the heads of dogs, and dogmen with the heads of gorillas.
Dogman Happened.
As told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ River. I was an avid outdoorsman the first half of my life and an avid city dweller since then. What happened to change my likes and dislikes so intensely? Dogman is what happened. This story happened around 10 years ago when I was 35. I'd been out of work for over a year, and the stress broke up my marriage. Things are okay for me now, but that was definitely a downtime. I was living out of my car and hunting for most of my food. I'd hunt small game because I had no refrigerator, and whatever I didn't eat that day would be left behind for the scavengers. The other scavengers, I mean, beside myself. So ironically, this story, which is about me hunting for Dogman, does not start with me out hunting. It starts with me fishing. Well, I guess fishing is hunting too. It was a nice autumn day, and so I was fishing for black crappie with some minnow bait I got my hands on. I was doing well too. I'd caught 2 pretty big ones and 1 medium before 7 a.m. I know, because after I caught the third, I thought I saw someone peeking out at me from across the lake. I checked the time and made a mental note that it was just 7 a.m. I didn't get another bite that morning, but I kept trying up until noon when my stomach started asking me for some fish. The entire time I had a feeling like I was being watched, kept catching little glimpses of movements from the exact same spot, right across the lake, directly opposite me. I kept an eye on the spot while I cleaned the fish and cooked them over my fire. After eating and still feeling spied on, I trained my rifle on the spot and looked through my high-powered scope to see what I could see. I rested it on a rock and got into a comfortable position behind, ready to just lay there on the sand, waiting and watching through the scope. And so that's what I did for quite some time. It's not like I had something better to do anyway. One of the few positive side effects of falling through the grid is that you can sometimes be taught patience, or you get so exhausted from stress that you become the equivalent of patient. Either way, I waited, and I watched, and I was prepared to continue doing both into the indeterminate future. Then I saw it. It was a bear leaning on a tree. A bear leaning on a tree for hours? Maybe it was interested in my fish, or maybe it was doing something else over there and not actually watching me at all. Maybe it was eating its own kill, or maybe it was playing with its family. I was about to put down the scope when I saw the creature's hand. Yes, I do mean hand, and not paw. The fingers were too long to be part of a bear's paw. They looked like human hands, except that their claws were ridiculously long. Could it be some sicko in a monster suit? I'd better be careful. I wouldn't want to shoot a monster and have it turn out to be some teenager or something. By the time I was thinking that thought, I'd already made it halfway around the lake. I wanted to see more. If this was some kind of exotic animal, I could probably get enough money from bringing in its body that I could get back on my feet again. I had literally nothing to lose. If it turned out to be Bigfoot and I can capture it or kill it, I'm a millionaire. If it turns out to be Bigfoot and he stomps me out of existence, well, at least I went out trying. There's no way I could forgive myself for not trying. Poverty can be soul-crushing sometimes, but a true motivator other times. This was one of those other times. So now, while I was making my way around, I had no idea if this thing was noticing my movement or not. To keep myself hidden, I'd crawled back behind the rock I was using for cover, and then was walking about 1 tree back from the edge around the somewhat circular lake. I tried to keep the spot in focus, but did not waste any time by stopping to check through my scope. I just wanted to get there before the Bigfoot, or whatever it was, realized I had left my side of the water. I was attempting to guesstimate how much further I had to go when there suddenly was an eruption of noise and activity around where the spot had been. Was I discovered? As I watched in confusion, trying to understand what was happening in the bushes, I got hit in the chest with a bellow from whatever the beast was. It sounded almost like a bark. I had heard that Bigfoot could scream so loud it felt like you had been struck in the chest. That's a good way to describe what it felt like to me when that thing barked or shouted. I was completely at a loss as to what to do. I felt panicked in a way I'd never felt before. I can't even explain it, but all logic left me and I stood there befuddled. I didn't run, I didn't charge, I didn't back off, and I didn't advance. I just stood there. The creature advanced toward me, and all I did was wonder what it would look like when I finally got to see it. I didn't wonder what it would do to me or anything else. I just sort of wondered what would happen next in a bizarrely and unnaturally calm state. Then the creature broke through the woods. It was much taller than I had expected. It had strange legs like a minotaur, I thought at first, but they were not cloven hooves. They were like dog feet, only bigger. The feet were much too small to be Bigfoot feet, though. I now started to feel dizzy, and the world spun a bit around me. My eyes went up from the legs to the torso, which was entirely covered in dark gray and brown hair, unlike any kind of animal I'd seen. The chest was massive, like an Olympic bodybuilder or something. This guy looked like he had zero body fat and more muscle than possible. Its arms were like fur-covered human arms, popping with muscles and ending in immense, sharp claws. I want to say there were 4 fingers and a thumb on each hand, but it might have been 3 fingers. They definitely had thumbs, however. And then the creature bent down and started smelling me, and I could see this was not a Bigfoot at all. It did not have the head of a primate. It was not like a gorilla or human head at all. It was the head of a wolf or a wolf-like dog, a dark-furred, very angry, extraordinarily muscular dog or wolf that walked like a man. And whatever it smelled on me, it didn't seem to like it. The monster fell to all fours, tilted its head back, and howled. It felt like it nearly burst my eardrums, and I heard a ringing sound for a while afterward. But the ringing sound wasn't so loud that I couldn't hear other howls coming in return. There was more than one of these things. Of course there were. There's more than one of everything. That's when all the shock wore off in an instant, and the cash register in my head started to go ding. I backed off, slowly, pointing my weapon to the ground. This seemed to surprise the dogman. He sniffed the air wildly. I took another slow step back, then another. The great beast snorted as though in disgust at my cowardice. I took another step back, and it grunted, then turned quickly and melted into the forest, disappearing in an almost supernaturally fast manner. My knees buckled under me as I understood the danger was over. For the moment. Because I also knew I was going to track this thing and find where they all live. There was $1 million in this somehow, some way, and I needed more info on this creature before I could cash in. This might be bigger than Bigfoot, actual, living werewolves. I wondered how they came to be. Was it a mutated dog or a wolf? Or had werewolves always been a real animal all along? My life now had a purpose, and I had a reason to get up in the morning besides the usual hunger pangs. I suddenly knew what my mission was besides survival and subsistence. My goal was to bring back some sort of definitive proof of the existence of these giant, dog-headed, hairy men. That would be my ticket back onto the grid. I immediately began tracking the creature, as in immediately. It wasn't exactly hiding its path. In fact, it seemed to be causing as much destruction in its wake as possible, probably to mark its turf more clearly. You can tell how sick I had grown of living out of my car. I knew that one of these dogmen could kill me, and yet I was following a trail back to where I expected to see an entire family of them. There was nothing else in my life at that point which would give me the chance to rejoin humanity. Over a week later, I was still following the trail which wound around and crossed over itself multiple times throughout the forest. I subsisted by dining on acorns and sometimes the squirrels I stole the acorns from. I felt very at peace, ready at any moment to either achieve something great or else literally die trying. I had come to terms with the idea of death and was ready to accept whatever script I got handed. Eventually, I actually located a group of the dogmen. I don't think this was a home or nest. I think they were just relaxing and grooming each other in a clearing. They appeared to have eaten recently, although I saw no signs and smelled no smells of a carcass. After an extended period of spying from a distance of approximately 830 yards, I had still not formulated a plan, but I had sussed out that there was what appeared to be a nuclear family in front of me. There were 2 large ones and 4 small ones. I can only assume they were parents and offspring. The younger ones were pretty big in their own right. They appeared to stand almost 5 feet tall, whereas the parents were more like 6 to 7 feet tall. Sometimes you formulate amazing, seemingly perfect plans, and then fate makes them go all wrong. Other times, fate makes a plan for you, and you find yourself thrust into it. One of the young dogmen decided to go for a walk in the forest in my direction. It was not followed by the others, so I assumed it was understood by the entire family that the young one was not going far. All I hoped was that he would go far enough. As I watched him or her walk away from the others and closer to me, I was weighing the creature in my mind. Unlike the parents, it was skinny. It looked lighter than a human, maybe 100 pounds on the outside. If I got a shot off, how far and how fast could I carry the body before the parents and siblings caught up to me? Could I get it back to my car? And if I did, would I be safe in the car? At that point, I started doing mental calculations about how far away my old Ford might be. I'd been following this trail for days, but it had wandered in circles. If my compass was correct, and it often was, then I might be about an hour's walking from my car. That's an hour walking with a backpack. I'm not sure how long it would take to walk while carrying a dead teenage dogman. I was praying I would live long enough to find out. The young creature was now probably only about 40 feet away. I resolved to wait until it had passed me, then get between it and the family and let him or her have it before they knew what was happening. Then I'd grab the body and run. Sounded simple in my mind. Very little chance it could play out so simply in real life. The creature stopped. It stopped. It stopped about 15 feet short of my hiding spot. Had it seen me or smelled me? Then I heard a sound of water falling and smelled an unmistakable scent. The creature must be male, judging from how high it was aiming while it relieved itself. Quite impressive, actually. Now, I had a problem. The creature never made it all the way to me. If I took a shot at it now, I'd have to shoot toward the others. It could run back to them, or if I missed, it could attack me. My mind was filled with confusion. I saw the young dogman begin to turn to rejoin his family, and all time slowed to a near standstill. My body took off toward the creature. I wanted to get between it and its parents, and my only time to do it was the present moment. I was probably running to my death, but I did it anyway. I was so loud, crashing through the bushes and trees, that of course the young dogman heard me. He turned and looked. and I swear he turned his head sideways, questioning at me like the old RCA Victor logo. I almost laughed in the second. It was a real namaste moment for me. I saw another point of consciousness in the eyes of that creature. That's why it pained me in the heart to lift my rifle and aim at it. That's what I did. Because ending this innocent animal's life would gain me the approval of other hominids of my own kind. Knowing that I was probably sealing my death warrant, I took aim at the creature's head at maybe 5-foot range. There was no way I could miss. I pulled the trigger, the gun recoiled and threw me backward into the tree behind me. I knew I had to get out of there fast, so I looked for the body. I couldn't see any body. I looked around more, growing more nervous by the second. There was no body. Then I noticed the other thing. There were no other dogmen. The entire family had disappeared. I guess at the second I pulled the trigger. Were they still around me, but invisible? The idea sent a chill through my entire body. I stopped and listened, but I couldn't hear anything over my own heart beating. I turned in the direction I thought my car would be parked in and ran. I ran for however long it took, probably an hour or more. I'm a bit blank about that. I just know that when I got in the car, I turned the ignition and drove. I drove as far away from that place as I could get on a half-filled tank. I literally drove till I ran out of gas, then I went in the back seat and passed out. I don't know how long I slept. Life had become too surreal to count minutes any longer. I got out my gas can and started to walk forward, not really sure how long it would be till the next gas station. So the Dogman was not my ticket out of poverty, but at least I was still alive. When I reached the gas station, I met a nice old preacher named John. He offered to pay for my gas if I could drive him to the next state over. He was starting a new mission to help the homeless. Well, I told him, by a remarkable coincidence, I happened to be homeless. I drove Preacher John where he wanted to go, on his dime, and when we got there, I got out with him. He gave me a paying job and a room to sleep in, and now 10 years later, I'm back in control of my life again. So in the sense that Dogman frightened me off in the direction of that gas station, where my life was changed forever, I guess you could say that Dogman was an agent of fate. I guess you could say Dogman saved my life.
Dogman Thanksgiving. As told to Peter Bernard. Read by Madeline Starr. This is a story from when I was a young girl, which was more than a little while ago. It's about the time my aunt and I went for a walk on Thanksgiving and ran directly into a family of, for lack of a better term, dogmen. My father was always the only one in our entire extended family to accept an invitation to spend Thanksgiving out in New Jersey at the home of our mean Uncle Jack. He was also our rich Uncle Jack, so Dad would kiss up to him no matter how rude, hurtful, or pompous he got. Everything you or anyone said was wrong to Uncle Jack. Being wrong meant you had to endure a lecture from your favorite uncle. Yes, he would call himself that. When he was done, he would demand that you then repeat it back to him enthusiastically. I always did as I was told, yet still never received any forgiveness or acknowledgement. Once Uncle Jack declared you wrong, you were permanently wrong. There was no way to win against his half-logic. My mother always said the only reason we went to visit him was so that he'd leave us some of his millions in his will. The rest of our family either had their own money or else had self-respect. But my father loved Uncle Jack.
Even years later, when the nasty old man died, leaving nothing in his will to us except an explanation of why we didn't deserve to get anything from him, Dad still found excuses for old Uncle Jack. "Oh, he was just angry at the end because of the medication," he would say. "Then why was he angry all the years leading up to that?" we would ask once Dad was out of earshot. As mean as Uncle Jack was, that's how nice his long-suffering wife, Aunt Dottie, was. We had to endure an entire day of Uncle Jack once a year, but she had to endure an entire life with him. So we bonded in that way only prisoners can. Her duties as hostess would keep her busy most of the day, but each year on Thanksgiving, she'd clear some of that time so she and I could have a private walk out into the forest behind their property. Their actual backyard was not all that large, but it had pear trees and berries growing and a pond with goldfish imported into it. I would stare at them sometimes, and they would stare back at me. Those fish and I also bonded in that way only prisoners can. Behind the hilly scenic backyard, looming like a dark curtain at the back of a theater stage, was a very old growth forest. Or at least that's how I remember it. Very tall trees packed extremely close together. I used to call it the Bug's House when I was little, because it was so dark in there, it was like being inside, yet it was crawling with bugs everywhere. One year, Aunt Dottie and I sat on a big flat rock, and she told me a story about the people who live under the ground. She got me pretty spooked. Then we stood up, and she tilted the rock we had been sitting on. Underneath, it was entirely crawling with bugs. At first I screamed, but when I saw that Aunt Dottie wasn't scared of them, and even found them interesting, suddenly I found them interesting too. She had proven her point. There were people, of a sort, living underneath us no matter where we went. But for some reason I got the feeling she was implying there were much larger kinds of people living underneath us. I wondered all year what she was talking about, but we were not invited back until the next Thanksgiving, so my questions had to wait. When the holiday finally came, I was very excited to see Aunt Dottie and began barraging her with questions. I was shocked and disappointed when we got there to find that Aunt Dottie had taken ill and was confined to an electric wheelchair. There was a nurse minding her and another lady cooking and serving, while Aunt Dottie sat there looking tired. She even took a nap about an hour after we got there. Finally, about 20 minutes before dinner, Dottie had a burst of energy, and after some negotiations with the nurse, I was allowed to go for a walk in the forest with my aunt. We could only go so far before the going would be too rough for her wheelchair, but we could still get a good 5 minutes into the woods. She could still think and speak normally, she was just a lot more tired than usual. It felt great to get away from the others and just hang out. We got so caught up in the reminiscing that we actually lost track a bit of where we were. There were 3 points where we could make turns, and I had forgotten which choice we took where. I don't think Aunt Dottie remembered either. We started heading back, but got confused again at the next crossroads. My aunt was clearly distressed. I don't think she had been out here for a long time, and I had never been through this maze more than once a year, so I certainly didn't know which way to go. We made a choice and headed in that direction. "No, there's grass here," Aunt Dottie said as we reached another crossroads. "We only came down dirt paths to get here, so that means—" She fell silent. I got worried that she was having some kind of attack or something, but then she made eye contact with me and motioned toward the bush directly in front of us. It was shaking as though something were behind it. That's because something was. Actually, more than one something, 3 to be precise. 3 puppies came bounding out of the bushes. "Oh no," said Aunt Dottie quietly, looking around nervously. "What's the matter, Aunt Dottie?" I asked. "It's just 3 puppies." Aunt Dottie shushed me in a curt fashion I had never witnessed from her before. I was a bit hurt, but a lot more concerned. I started looking around too, but I had no idea what I was looking for. I heard a growling, but it didn't seem to be coming from the puppies. They were all playing with each other and running in circles, making yipping noises. I saw Aunt Dottie begin to cry. That made my eyes tear up too. I decided to start pushing her wheelchair back in the way we came. I don't think I took more than 2 steps before my aunt and I realized in the same instant that I was actually moving us closer to the growling sound. Before I could stop, let alone reverse our course, the brush in front of us exploded and a huge figure stood up quickly, making some sort of roar. I fell to the ground screaming, and I know my aunt was screaming as well. I never actually looked at what was standing there. I just knew it was tall and dark and loud, and it did not like us. I was hiding as small as I could by the right wheel of the wheelchair, and the screaming shadow was to my aunt's front and left. I realized that it was my job to protect my aunt, so I decided I had no choice but to stand up. As I did so, out of my left eye, I caught sight of another tall shadow. It was a kind of a man, but it was also a kind of a dog. It stood like a man, but it had weird legs like a dog or deer or something like that. It kind of looked like a kangaroo with a dog tail and a man's broad chest. It had huge claws and teeth that looked more like alligator's teeth than a dog or wolf's teeth. It was dark and furry all over, and it had tall, pointed ears. I could tell from the position of the ears that it was not angry at me. It gestured for us to walk past it. I'll repeat that to make sure it sinks in. The tall, muscular, hairy man with the dog's head and a mouth full of immense fangs gestured politely for us to pass it. At this point, I should say my aunt was still weeping in her chair. She had not seen the dog man. She was facing away from him, staring at the shadow that was still growling at us. I finally turned to study the shadow and saw that it was another dog man. This one, however, had its ears directly back and its teeth bared in a menacing way. It didn't just look angry, it looked utterly insane. It growled like a big cat, like a tiger. While I studied it, one of the puppies danced over to me, on its hind legs, yipping playfully and inviting me to play. "Don't touch it," squealed Aunt Dottie. "Don't even make eye contact with it." The fur on the back of the screaming shadow stood on end as it grew increasingly more agitated. I could see now that it was a female. It was the mother. That's what Aunt Dottie had meant. The mother thinks we're going to hurt her puppies. And so we're in a whole mess of trouble right now. I turned around and the other dog man was still there. This one was a dog man. And I won't get into how I am sure about that, but I was and am 100% certain. Maybe he was the father and maybe not, but he was panting and wheezing in a friendly manner and seemed to want us to walk that way. Not seeing that we had much of a choice, I began slowly casually wheeling my aunt in her wheelchair backward, away from the mother and her pups, and toward the man monster she had not yet seen. The first step went fine. The second step back went equally well. Mother Dog was not any calmer, but she seemed to be willing to let us leave. On the third step, however, I snapped a twig, loudly. One of the puppies yipped in surprise, and its mother utterly freaked out, charging directly at the wheelchair. I started to pull backwards, then Aunt Dottie overruled me and slammed that thing in reverse using her electric motor. I don't know how fast she was going, but it was fast enough that she knocked me sideways and I almost fell. Recovering, I ran after my aunt. I saw her slow down a bit to let me catch up, and I surmised that the female must have halted her charge behind us. As we continued our exit, I helped my aunt do a tight U-turn, and we continued on toward the male dogman. He, I swear to you, gave me a sort of heads-up motion and then continued on back to his mate and her offspring. He tilted his chin up in the air as we went past. Later in life, I actually had 2 different cats that would do that when I came home. They'd give me the heads up. But the first non-human I ever saw do that was Dogman. Not only did he not seem evil, he seemed intelligent. I was no longer scared for my life, and more concerned with how we would get out of the woods, when I noticed my aunt wasn't beside me. Looking back, I discovered she had fainted when the male dogman walked past us. Seems funny now. But at the time, I thought something worse had happened. She had never even been aware of his presence through all this, and she never realized he was actually being friendly towards us and helping us escape his angry mate. I went back and got her, and it turned out we were right by her house the whole time. Whether he knew it or was just trying to calm his wife down, the tall male dogman was actually giving us the directions to get home. Aunt Dottie woke up before we were halfway through the backyard, and she made me swear not to tell anyone about this story at all, especially not mean Uncle Jack. So when my parents kept asking me why it looked like I had been crying, and why my dress was dirty, and why I didn't want any dessert later, Aunt Dottie and I made up excuses. Later we went into the kitchen while dishes were being washed, and she and her maid both told me stories of the dogmen and how they prowl around in that forest hunting for game. Sometimes they will chase a rabbit right out into the backyard. That terrified me, and I looked out the window studying the tree line for the entire rest of the conversation. Aunt Dottie told me she'd never seen them in the daylight before, so she had no idea she was placing us both in danger when we took our walk. Before the next Thanksgiving, Aunt Dottie was gone. We went out to visit cranky Uncle Jack and his 5 or 6 servants he'd hired to replace Dottie. It was as dreary as you'd imagine it would be. I spent the day by the goldfish pond, watching them swim. Sometime in the late afternoon, I heard a howling from the woods. I don't have to tell you that I spent the rest of the day and evening indoors. When it was time to go, I practically ran into my parents' car. A few years later, my mother was telling me stories about Aunt Dottie that I had never heard before. I started to tell her this story, but when I got to the part about the roaring 2-legged giant dog lady monster, my mother talked over me. She interrupted me and talked over me with some other story about some entirely different thing that had once happened to Aunt Dottie. She was just not going to hear it. She wasn't going to form an opinion on it. She wasn't going to believe or disbelieve it. She was just never going to hear my Dogman story. So, I got the hint, and I never tried to tell anyone what happened ever again. Recently, my nephew was showing me Dogman stories on YouTube, and I told him about my encounter. He told me I should write it for Reddit or a channel like yours. My nephew informs me that Dogman is considered evil. Certainly, the male Dogman I encountered seemed like an okay guy, really. I'd say if people got an evil kind of vibe off the creature when they saw it, they might have interrupted its hunting, or they might have come between a Dogman mother and her puppies. And as I learned from personal experience, that is not a place you ever want to be. Here's wishing you all have a happy and safe Thanksgiving.
Hey all, I'm out here in the cold across the street from the alleged actual location that this allegedly true Dogman story allegedly took place in. If I start stuttering with chattering teeth in the middle of this, it might mean I'm frightened, or it might mean I'm just freezing because it's cold out here. Anyway, I want to read you this story that got sent in that tells a very rare tale of a very rare werewolf in New York City. So without further ado, here is The Dogman in the Church. As told to Peter Bernard. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I like your channel and all, but my only real disappointment with what you do is how few of your stories take place in New York City. I mean, why even have New York City in your title if all your stories seem to take place in the forest? I know you're probably saying, but how many Dogman or Bigfoot stories take place in Manhattan or Brooklyn? And I guess you might have a good point. But I actually do know of one Dogman story that took place in Manhattan, or a werewolf story at least, and it's a story that happened to me personally. Now this didn't happen in the kind of Manhattan we know today. Although some rich people lived here back then, a lot more poor people did. See, back then the rich people mostly lived in the boonies out at stately Wayne Manor with Dick and Bruce. The city apartments back then were crammed full of the poor people who now sleep on the sidewalks in front of rich people's condos. Anyway, in our neighborhood, there was an old church which had gone abandoned. It's long since been fixed up and it's very active again, serving congregations of several religions, running a soup kitchen that feeds the homeless, and staging concerts for charity. But back then it was abandoned and entirely empty. Well, that's not exactly true. There was one soul living there. Before I go further, I think we should define some terms so that you understand the rest of what I'm going to try and tell you. I know some people use the word dogman in the same way that other people use the word werewolf or wolfman, and that some people even think that dogman and Bigfoot are the same thing. Now I'm going to use all these words to describe what my friends and I ran into inside that church back in the 1970s. But what I mean in this case is a creature covered in hair, standing between 6 and 7 feet tall, with pointed dog ears on top of its head and a huge row of teeth on top and bottom. The creature I saw appeared to be wearing torn clothing, and so I think it was a werewolf like in the old movies. I think it was a man who transformed into the thing we saw, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, like I said already, the church was closed. My buddies and I back then were teenagers, and like most people that age, we were always looking for places we could go to do teenager stuff, out of view of adults and authority figures. So we found a way to sneak into the old abandoned church. Don't try this at home, kids. Back then, it wasn't called urban exploration yet. It was just basically breaking and entering. But we were more interested in having fun than waiting 40 years to become trendy. So inside, the pews were all still there, and the basic structure of the altar was there as well. At first, the guys wanted to actually hang out in the altar, but I was raised Roman Catholic, and I didn't want to disrespect the altar of a church, even an abandoned one. I dragged them to the back, and we partied for a while there in the darkness. Here and there, throughout the night, we kept hearing what we thought was a motorboat sound. Who keeps revving that motorboat engine, we'd ask each other, but when it didn't continue, we'd forget about it for a while until it would return. Our one friend, he kept running back and forth, sort of driving me nuts. He'd just run up the center aisle, literally jump and bounce off the altar, then run back down the aisle, and leave and bounce off the church doors and start all over again. It got so annoying that while he was running up toward the altar, I snuck over and unlocked the front doors. I figured he'd fly out onto the front pavement and slide the rest of the way home, but one of our friends warned him just in time to ruin my fun. Later into the night, the motorboat sound started to increasingly bother us, and we found ourselves talking a lot less and listening a lot more. "It's coming from below," one of my buddies pointed out. He was right, it definitely was. I looked down, and for a second, through a hole in the floor, I could swear I saw an eye. I saw an eye looking right back at me. I told the guys, and for some reason this excited them. They all wanted to go downstairs and mess with whoever was down in the basement. I certainly did not want to do this. They asked why. I told them. The eye, it didn't look normal, and it looked angry. Okay, that was not a deterrent. They all began frantically looking around for the way to get downstairs. One of them found the door and the staircase, and everyone ran down there. I didn't want to go, but being upstairs alone was just as creepy as the idea of being down there with the guys. So down the creepy, creaking stairs we went, with the dumber ones in our group shouting out taunts to the bum they thought they were about to encounter and push around. But what happened after we got down there surprised all of us. What happened when we got down there was nothing. There was no sound from anywhere. There was no movement from anywhere. Of course, none of us geniuses had brought a flashlight with us, so there could have been a half dozen people there, and we wouldn't have been able to see them as long as they held still. After a while, the guys started making fun of me for saying I saw an eye, implying that I had been pranking them. I agreed that it was just a joke and encouraged them to come back upstairs. When they agreed, I bolted back up, probably setting some sort of land speed record. Then 2 more of my buddies made it upstairs, and they started roughhousing with me and congratulating me on tricking all of them with the eye gag. Our 4th friend, the one who had been running back and forth earlier, he never came upstairs behind us. I pointed this out to the other 2, and they called downstairs to him a couple of times. We all walked over to the basement door and looked down into the darkness, but there was no sign of him. I remember in the middle of us all calling for him, we heard a terrifying scream from the cellar. And it was most definitely the voice of our friend. None of the 3 of us made a move. I asked him if he was joking or if he really needed our help, but I got my answer a second later as he came running up the stairs with his eyes bugging out. He ran directly into us and we all fell over backward. The 3 of us weren't hurt too badly. In fact, we thought it was kind of funny at the time, but our buddy was not joking around. While we laid there on the dusty church floor laughing at what just happened, he kept running and got clear out of the church. We didn't hear from him again that night, but we didn't mind. We suddenly had a bigger problem. It turned out our friend was running because he was being chased. The thing that was chasing our friend had come up the stairs. It was standing in the doorway, looking down at our stupid giggling faces. It was what I already told you it would be, a tall, hairy man with a dog's head. Not 7 or 8 feet tall like some of the Dogman stories I hear online, but definitely at least 6 feet tall. He had dark pants on and a light-colored torn shirt. He had immense teeth. He was emitting a motorboat sound. He was growling. He was growling at us. Then he roared. I don't remember exactly what happened after that, except that I ended up in my bedroom a block and a half away with my covers up over my head, which is how I slept that night. My friends and I compared notes the next day, and we all saw the exact same thing. It had brown hair and lighter colored hair mixed in. It had red and yellow eyes. It was the size of a large man. None of us remember if it had shoes on, but it had pants and parts of a shirt. To us, it was either a werewolf or a nut job who was hiding in the church making himself up to look like a werewolf. But the makeup, if that's what it was far ahead of its time. It didn't look like a mask. It looked like a man who had half morphed into a dog. It looked like the Wolfman on TV, only better and much more realistic looking. In the years since then, I've never heard about Rick Baker practicing makeup in an abandoned church, so I feel a little more certain each year that whatever that thing was, it was a real something. A real dogman, a real werewolf, a real something. Maybe it was a human with a hormonal problem causing hair to grow abnormally thick on his face, chest, and hands. Of course, that wouldn't explain the immense fangs he put on display for us. The teeth were probably the scariest part about the thing. It looked like he could bite your arm or head right off if he wanted to. I don't even want to think about it. But to me, this was probably a werewolf, not a dogman. What I mean by that is that it must have been a human in the past, or it wouldn't be wearing clothes. If it wasn't a creature that transformed into the shape under the full moon, maybe it had been a human earlier in life, then got transformed by disease into looking like this? I had another theory back then when I was far more religious. I'm a little shy about telling people that theory these days because it seems a little crazy. But at the time, what I really felt about the creature was that it was a man possessed, like this man had been taken over by a demon, and that this demonic force or entity was transforming his human body into something hellish. We never heard of this creature again, and we certainly never heard anything in the news about a wolfman in the neighborhood. He had to have changed back to human form in order to escape and move on with his life. The city wasn't as crowded back then as now, but there's no way a wolfman walking down the street would have gone unnoticed. I can't really imagine any other possibility except that this thing we encountered was a human who somehow transformed into a man-wolf or man-dog creature. That leaves me in the uncomfortable place of having to admit to myself that the shape-shifting of humans into other forms must be possible. Is it something that happens to us against our will? Or was this monster we met a shaman who had adopted that shape at will? Although I will probably remain curious about this until I die, I'd far rather never find out than go in search of the answers and risk coming face to face ever again with those immense fangs.
And now, your second bonus story, all new and never heard before, Part 2 of Dogman Chased My Cat. Dogman Ruined My Life. As told to Peter Bernard. Read by PQ Ribber. Hey, Scary Stories. I'm the guy who wrote you about Dogman chasing my cat. I wanted to send an update, so now I'm back living in an apartment in the city, looking around for any sort of day job. All my everything is in that house, and so I have nothing to play the market with. I'm trying to sell the place at almost any price just to get back on my feet, but the property is a wreck at the moment, and I haven't got the funds to do much about it. My wife wants her investment in the house back, and our relationship has gone cold. She disrespects me in front of our daughter, who has begun to do the same. I noticed her dressing up more for work, but I wasn't allowed to kiss her because it would mess up her makeup. Then one day, just randomly, as the baby and I were out for a walk, I saw her on her lunch break with some dude. Like some dude who must have been from her job. I remembered that I had once been a dude from her job. She kept laughing at this guy's jokes. She seemed to like him in a more than a business way. I charged over to them with Anna in the stroller and confronted them. They didn't even look surprised to see me. They made sarcastic comments, calling me Mr. Mom, and pretending to compliment me on my stroller. That night, we had a very nasty argument, and she threw me out. I had no place to go except back to the house to try to figure out how to fix it up so it could be sold. My wife had the car keys, so I had to take the commuter train and then walk a great distance. By the time I got back to the house, I was completely tired. The kind of tired where even though you're also very hungry, you go to bed first and figure out the starvation angle after you wake up. So sometime later, I woke up completely disoriented in my darkened bedroom as I heard what I later found out was my back door being kicked in. The glass and wood from the former door had been sprayed all across the kitchen. Must have been hit with a tremendous force, since some of the shards and splinters were embedded and ate them an inch into the opposing wall. As I was still trying to understand where I was and remember who I was, the entire house shook, and I heard what at first sounded like a big tree about to fall over, like somebody should be yelling, "Timber!" I staggered out of bed and into the hallway, understanding where I was, but still not what was happening. Then, just as I rounded the corner into the living room, I once again heard the battle cry of the Dogman. He was in my living room and had apparently knocked down much of what I now realized was a supporting wall, as the ceiling between us and the kitchen was moving up and down, as if it were trying to decide if it should stay up or fall. While I was looking at that, the enraged Dogman picked up the ottoman and threw it straight into my belly, the force of which slammed me into the back wall. I was completely winded. It hurt everything. I tried to breathe in, but it was painful and just not happening. I tried again, and it almost worked. I tried again and again to breathe. It just seemed impossible, and I passed out. When I woke up, it was morning. I was lying under part of the roof. Almost none of the house was left standing. There was water everywhere. The kitchen and bathroom were destroyed. The entire upstairs was downstairs. But it was morning, and I was alive. With a sense of relief, I decided to get up and get that water turned off, until I realized I couldn't stand. I had severely injured my back. It's funny how you react to shocking events. My first fear was not that I would never walk again, or that nobody would come to rescue me. My first fear was that the Dogman would come back and eat me. But he didn't. And I was rescued later that morning by a total stranger who just happened to be driving by purely by chance. He called an ambulance, and I was taken here to the hospital, where they're teaching me to walk again. My wife has filed for divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty, and I'm in no shape to battle her. Her lawyer is trying to say I destroyed the house myself because I'm insane, and that the Dogman story proves my mental instability. So my lawyer wants me to say I never saw the creature. Obviously, my wife gets Anna, and she'll get whatever else she can as well, I'm sure. Sometimes I wish the Dogman had finished me off that day, but never for long. It's funny. Through all this, I'm not at all mad at him. I fought hard my entire life for my dream, and so did he. The only bad part is that both our dreams involve the same plot of land. Even though Dogman ruined my life, my two encounters with him will probably always be the most sublime moments that will ever happen to me. While horrifying, the creature is also absolutely magnificent in its utter embodiment of rage and savagery. It would have been enough scaring me off the property, but the monster tore my house down. I almost felt he only let me live just so I could warn the rest of you about him. But it's also possible I only lived by accident. Look, I know things are tough for me now, but someday I will walk again. Someday I will be financially solvent again. Someday I will see my beloved daughter again. But never, and I mean never, will I enter any forest anywhere that might be the turf of Dogman.
Check out the audio podcast version of Scary Stories NYC, now available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and other popular podcatchers. Bigfoot Attacked My Tiny House. Scary Stories by Peter Bernard, Volume 1, now available on Amazon in paperback, Kindle, and audiobook versions. Narrated by PQ Ribber and me, Madeline Starr. Forward by TV's famous Timothy Green Beckley, better known as Mr. UFO.
And if there's anyone out there who can't get enough of PQ Ribber, search in your favorite search engine for PQ Ribber, and you'll find plenty of podcasts, music, and weirdness. I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279.
Come back for more scary stories.